Hi, welcome to Murf+E Unfiltered Zero BS Biz Talk. I'm Kathleen Murphy, and I'm here today with my guest co-host, Stephen Shinnick. How are you, Stephen?
Good. Great to be here.
Good. Thanks for being in the studio with me today.
Yeah, appreciate the invite.
You're welcome. You're welcome. So today we're going to talk a little bit about risk-taking, and are you playing it too safe? The context for this particular topic is risk aversion is real, and it's far easier to play it safe and to stay in your lane, the proverbial lane, that is. And however, there are potentially more advantages to playing it safe, to not playing it safe rather, but how do you get to the mindset that will allow you to think this way? So I've got some thoughts in terms of how you might prepare your mind in terms of getting to a place where you're not going to be constantly in a state of being mindful of playing it safe and allowing yourself to take a risk.
Sure.
And one of the best strategies for me personally has been to be mindful of the fact that it's okay to take risks, it's okay to make mistakes, it's okay to challenge yourself. But if you think about it from a human perspective, we're really wired to keep ourselves safe and to not take risks.
Yeah.
So it's a little uncomfortable for most people to do this, as you have experienced. We've all experienced that. And there's this temptation not to take risks because of that, because your brain is wired to keep you in a place of not doing things that are going to put you in a place of jeopardy. But the fact that I find helps me to override that aversion to being risk adverse is the fact that I will then try to have sort of almost like a dreamlike state of thinking about, well, what if I achieved this risk that I'm taking? Do you remember a point when you realized that it was probably a better scenario than not to actually take a risk, and what was going on?
Yeah, so early on, I was about 7 years old. My parents took us down to Disney World.
Mm-hmm.
The park had just opened up, and my parents, for the first time, sort of let us run wild in the park. So they said, we'll do our own thing, and you guys do your own thing. And I concentrated way too much time on seeing certain things in the park. Mm. And at the end of the day, I get back together with my parents, and they had seen the entire park, done lots of things. They really experienced the park, had a wonderful time. And my brother and I had spent all of our time on these one or two attractions. And at the end of the day, we went back, and it was really a risk of the opportunity and the time where it was young enough where you're so excited about the opportunity that you spent all your time on it, and you really didn't focus on the other things that you could have also been doing at the park. So yes, we went, we had a great time, but we didn't really get to see the entire park. And I regretted that just even as a kid. So it was a very early lesson on, look around and make sure you see more things than just what you're excited about.
So were you encouraged by anybody other than yourself having that early experience to take risks? And what was it that brought you to that aha moment of this might be a better thing to do, to take risks versus playing it safe?
Sure. So I was encouraged to go to a certain school. I went to Babson, an entrepreneurial school. Mm-hmm. And there was one gentleman that my father had introduced me to, an advisor, someone that was really influential. Mm-hmm. And sat down with me for about an hour, invited me to have a adult conversation when I was 17 years old, and explained, that this was a big decision, a big choice, and a big risk. And I could choose to go into that, having this one conversation, and I chose to do it. I took that risk. I get out of my comfort zone with what I would have done is, keep at my normal college choices, and instead I made a riskier college choice. And it started me on a tremendous path of learning, because I did take the risk. Therefore, I learned how to take more risks, given that you can take a risk and be successful. You can take a risk and fail. But the one thing you should do is definitely take the risk, because you're going to learn either way.
Right. So I remember about probably one of the first professional risks I took, and it was to go and work for a startup magazine that had a tremendous amount of promise, of course, or so I thought, and so did everybody else that was on board with that particular project. And then in less than a year, come to find out, the company failed. I literally showed up at work one day, the door was, shut, my paycheck bounced, and it was a pretty good lesson in terms of experiencing taking a risk and seeing whether it would pay off or not. And I remember also another risk that I took more recently in the last 5 years, which was when I was accepting my first paid speaking engagement and being really nervous up front, more so about what I would charge for accepting this particular role. But that one paid off, I can say, because the event was successful and I got paid the money that I was looking to get paid. So that all sorted out the way that I expected it to. Let's talk a little bit about some of the things that can cross your mind in terms of taking risks. So I think normally people think about, they go to a place usually of what can go wrong. They go through this laundry list of all those things that could possibly happen that will be negative. And they may also consider, is this too risky? They may have a scale of risk, but they're not really sure about exercising that scale all the time. So they just go to number 10 being the worst amount of risk and highest that they could take. And then I think that people need to also consider, well, they may not have to take this risk on all by themselves. There could be supporting people that will help them to take on this risk. So it's not always just you. That can help to minimize, some of that risk. And then there are certainly categories of risks, types of risks that one could take, whether that be professional, personal, etc., that are out there, like social. Let's talk about also maybe taking some smaller risks. Give me an example of maybe a smaller risk in a category that perhaps might be outside of the social, or let's say the personal or the professional. I think that we had talked before we came into the studio about time as a risk.
Yeah, if you're, when you're younger in your career, anything that's put in front of you can be an opportunity, and you can chase the shiny object. Mm-hmm. But when you really start to get more experience, you start to understand that this shiny object is simply shiny. Sure. And you need to be able to assess different opportunities, because if you are going to put yourself into a situation and work hard at something, and there is real risk, mm-hmm. you really have to dedicate yourself to that opportunity. Mm-hmm. And if you go into it thinking that what else is behind this, or what am I missing out on, because you're going to be using, like you said, a tremendous amount of time, mm-hmm. and you won't get that time back. Right. And people forget, and they don't factor in the risk of the time loss. Sure. Whether you spend, like I did, 8 years in New York building up a business to then sell it. Right. It's like I had to leave the family and travel and be away, and right. there's a personal risk, there's a social risk, mm-hmm. there's a financial risk. Mm-hmm. So you try to make a T account, and there's pros and cons, mm-hmm. and you assess those. But you always do that in terms of time, because right. this opportunity is now. Right. And you know that if you don't take one of the opportunities, it probably won't come back. That's right. So do an honest assessment of the place you're at, the time you have, the time you're willing to dedicate, because that's one thing you will not get back is time. Right, and I like the comment that you made in terms of thinking about it from the perspective of, don't think that this opportunity is going to come around again. Yeah. Chances are, like the lottery, if you win it once, you're probably not going to win that big lottery number again. Yeah, unless you're doing it yourself. Like you mentioned social, there's mm-hmm. usually a team of people, mm-hmm. or at least one or two, sure. maybe a small team of 3 to 5, right. that are really going to do this. Mm-hmm. And to get that group of people together in your career more than once or twice or 3 times. Some people are professional at it, they do it really well. Right. But for most people, it's difficult to really get all of those people, to the right place at the right time, to all take the risk together, mm-hmm. And spend that time. So right. When you do make a decision, and it's a decision to not do this, but right. to do that, assume that the other opportunity will not come back. Exactly. One of the other things that I think is really important to consider when you're taking risks also is the amount, not just the time factor and who else is involved, but the energy level factor that you're going to need, because it takes a tremendous amount of energy to put forward to take on these risks. And thinking the risk through
like you said, make a T column in terms of pros and cons, but maybe even taking it a step further and then assigning
A weight to it.
exactly in terms of whether this is something that you should do, even if it's like 50-50. I always say go for it. If you're wavering, I generally will say take the risk.
Yeah.
Whether it pays off or not is
Sure.
is to be determined, but you're going to learn arguably as much if you fail at taking that risk as you would if you were to benefit from the risk.
Yeah, and you have to know when to maybe step away from that risk. If someone is asking you to cross moral lines or ethical lines and it's
Yes.
something you truly disagree with,
Right.
there may be enough financial risk or time risk involved in the opportunity where you really start to have difficulty with moral and ethical decisions.
Absolutely.
But you need to let those rule your decision, because the risk of doing something immoral or unethical or not to yourself really costs you your reputation. And you want to be able to move forward, even if it's a failure, and try again, because next time you'll have more experience and you'll lessen the risk of either associating with those people or financing in a certain way. The risk will be lessened next time if you just embrace the failure.
Exactly. So on the vein of thinking, one of the things that I was thinking about was I have never really considered measuring my risk against somebody else, because we can't do that. Somebody else's risk tolerance is going to be far different than ours. It's not fair for us to determine what there should be. We only know what ours is. So I think that that's a consideration that needs to be thought about. And then also not measuring my success of the risk in terms of the outcome against anybody else. Maybe somebody else has done this before, and maybe they took home a $1 billion paycheck from that risk that they took in terms of maybe standing up and selling a business. But maybe if you were to sell your business and you make, let's say, $1 million, is it fair to say that one was more successful than the other if your only determination is a monetary value? Well, maybe you never set out to have that $1 billion goal. And so I think it's important for people to recognize that they need to have their own goals and not necessarily be subjected to feeling as if they are constrained or need to be constrained by what other people have done. Don't do that. I think that's a big risk.
If you've set your social, your financial, your time goals, you've set up your pros and cons. What that really means is you've set your own personal goals and maybe your personal expectations for what the outcome might be of that. If you haven't done that, that's critical, because you will try to measure your outcome potentially against other people, which will simply, not be valuable to you as a person. Your self-awareness, your confidence isn't built by looking at what other people have done for the risks that they took.
If anything, I think it's a
risk
distractor.
to buy a lottery ticket,
Right, exactly.
But ultimately, the winner of that, it's luck. It's a lottery ticket. But if you've built your strategy for risk and then you've accomplished your goal, you certainly have to be self-satisfied that you've accomplished what you set out for.
I think so,
what
too.
you set out to do.
I think so. So I have some tips I'm going to share.
Right.
And the first one is, what's on your list of experiences or accomplishments? That's something I think people need to think about. And is your list a safe list and defined as potentially being non-risky? And only the person evaluating that can really honestly measure that. The next one is consider taking your list to a different level. So upping the increase of your risk tolerance. And then one that potentially you're slightly uncomfortable with, getting out of that comfort zone that people talk about. It's real. And people prefer to not change, not rock the boat, keep things the same. Human nature, people don't enjoy change. Most people don't. People that are more perhaps risk adverse may just be a little bit more comfortable with that, but I think that's something that's important to consider as well. And then think about taking the risk and accomplishing what's on that list. Pick out one or two things. And perhaps, I think, just be satisfied with the fact that you may have even just attempted it. And then ask yourself why you're playing it safe. There's probably a lot of psychology behind why people tend to play it safe. A lot more factors than we could ever go into during the course of this discussion. But it's something that I think people need to have an honest discussion with themselves. or perhaps with somebody else if they feel as if they can't
Yeah, I
go
think
there.
that's critical. If you're having that honest discussion, either that's on a long run or a drive or with a key, like I did in my career, someone stepped into my situation and offered me advice. And it's a risk to both take the advice
Sure.
or not take the advice.
Right,
You have to
is.
make that decision.
You do,
Yeah.
Absolutely. And then write down your reasons. Don't just put words to it. Actually make it tangible so that you can go back and take a look at it, because sometimes that's going to give you some additional insight into understanding.
And check in on it. If it's a 1-year project or a 1-year commitment, put a time limit to what
Sure.
your risk exposure is.
Right.
If it's 3 months and $10,000, or if it's a year and $1 million with
Right.
someone else's money, those are very different things to consider. But put in checkpoints where you can check how you're doing against your goals.
And then from your reasons of playing it safe list, take a look at having a third column in terms of the reasons and methods that you could apply to decrease or mitigate your risks. I think that's also very important to consider doing. And do you have suggestions also in terms of how people might go about looking at and thinking about mitigating some of their risks?
I would always offer that, I call them stoppers. If you're either stopping yourself or someone's in the way, or there's an obstacle or an objection, and you want to really, vet those. Really try to figure out, is this a real obstruction? Is this a real risk factor? Is it a real stopper? And don't kid yourself about what those are, because if you can concentrate on breaking through the true obstacles, you might be successful. If you're spending your time on things that are simply details or not true stoppers that are going to cause you to fail, you only want to spend your time on the toughest challenges, because that'll determine success or failure.
And I think a lot of people would gravitate towards avoiding some of the toughest challenges and try to go to the easy list, because it feels more satisfying, right? And keep the energy going and keep the motivation high. But it's those tough assignments on that list of taking those risks to get to the goal that you're achieving that you really have to push yourself through to get.
You do. If you don't have the money to
them.
start the business, you don't have the money.
Right.
Whether it's friends and family or you've raised money from banks, if you don't have the money, you don't have the money. And the money you're spending is either savings or money that you can't afford to lose.
Right.
So unless you can accomplish that first goal, the rest will not, probably will not be successful. If you do have the money, then the next challenge is obviously the tasks of what you set out to do. But always determine what's the most difficult thing to get. And that's not always money. Sometimes it's the best engineer or developer or something like that. And that, if you do have the money, the toughest challenge might be to find those key resources that you need to drive the business.
Right. So I have some additional tips that I'm going to share. And the first one is, are you content with staying in your proverbial safe lane and accepting what you have already accomplished as being good enough? Some people are, and that's fine. But honestly, given the pursuit of accomplishing something that you're setting out to accomplish that's hyper risk based, is it something that you have the tolerance for? I think that's something that everyone needs to consider. And we talked a little bit about that earlier. And then, do you know what it will take to provide you with the motivation to pursue accomplishing something that will require a risk way beyond your comfort level? And now factor in what's holding you back again on taking those risks. And yes, there will be plenty of valid reasons. We know that we've talked about a few of them already. But is it possible? Timing is also a challenge, and that's certainly a factor to consider, and that's real. And sometimes it doesn't play out in your favor. Just things can be ill times. You're ready to take the risk, but that's not in your favor. And then, who do you know that has taken on risks that you've seen them pay off? And perhaps, I guarantee you they've taken plenty of other risks and they haven't paid off. We just haven't seen them occur and we may not know about them. But then if you were to ask that same person that had the success and then talk to them also about the risks that they took that didn't succeed, I think you're going to learn a whole lot more than you might expect. It
Yeah.
always looks
Yeah,
easier.
you always don't know what effort it took, and if it came at a personal cost or a social cost or a health cost. If people took, you may judge that they're financially successful, but
Right.
that may not be socially or
Medically.
or their physical success
Right.
may have suffered from that level
right.
of. You're viewing it from one point of view, but the self-awareness there is critical to understand. Their view of success may have been just to cross the finish line.
Right.
You viewing
Yes.
that is, okay, they crossed the finish line, but they may have suffered from their health or from loss of friends or some other social cost that is way higher than would be acceptable to another person. So.
Exactly. So in terms of risk that I've personally taken, there are a couple that I wanted to mention. And the first one was when I came out and wrote my first book. That was incredibly,
Congratulations.
thank you. That was called Wisdom Whisperer, for those that aren't familiar with my brand. And, the writing, the publishing, the promoting of Wisdom Whisperer was incredibly risky for me. It was never something that I really set out to do, but I realized that it was a risk that I needed to take, so I took it. And now I just started promoting my third book, which it was
So
just
like
based
your
on
experience,
teams. So
get the first one done, now you have experience. Number 2, number 3 becomes much less risky because you know what that process is.
exactly. The second thing that I wanted to bring up as a risk that I took, that I went into with almost, I would say, just a zest for somehow figuring out how to make this work, was a sports coach research project that I embarked upon, where I originally thought I was going to only interview perhaps 20 or 30 sports coaches. I ended up interviewing 51, and the results from the experience were remarkable. But it was incredibly risky for me to do that because it was something I had never done before. I wasn't a researcher, but so worth taking the risk.
And think about maybe no one else had done it either.
That's right, exactly.
So now you're known for doing that,
That's
for
right.
taking that risk, and that's more of your brand.
That's right.
Someone else, you've discovered a valuable way to move forward with people and coaches, and now you're looked to provide advice maybe to them or to other people on how to do that, because that didn't exist before, or it existed in some limited way.
That's exactly right. So now from that experience, I've become an expert in the field of team dynamics and motivation and performance because of all the research that I've done. And it took 18 months to do that. That was no small project.
And it looks easy to other people.
It looks easy, right, exactly.
Which it isn't.
No, it's not. I mean, I have hundreds of hours probably dedicated to that project. So that's no small project. If we were to, as we're wrapping it up here, think about maybe some last pieces of advice that we would give to somebody that is still on the fence in terms of deciding whether they want to take a risk or not to do whatever it is, fill in the blank, that they want to do, what would be advice that you would give to somebody?
Well, if you're going to grow as a person, you need to take some type of risk. And if you're thinking about just, your social risks, your financial risks, professional risks, some people have different tolerance in different areas. So I think that level of self-awareness and your level of morals and ethics and what you're comfortable with is a base. If you want to travel more and meet people from foreign countries and don't speak foreign languages, I mean, that's a risk for most people.
I think worth taking.
I think the focus here is if you're going to take a business risk, then if you don't have those skills yourself, like speaking a language, then you need to associate yourself with people that have more experience, and either they join you in that effort or they simply mentor you and instruct you on the due diligence of looking at those risks and trying to mitigate them as much as possible. But everybody should take some, because that's how you're going to grow.
Exactly. So that's a perfect summarization of what I really wanted to express to people today in terms of how they could go about minimizing taking risks and looking at it from a different perspective, other than it just perhaps being something that they would be concerned about doing, and in fact hopefully now have some motivation to do just that. So I want to thank everybody today for being here with us and sharing your time with us. Please invite yourself back to be with us to listen to more Murf+E Unfiltered Zero BS Biz Talk shows in the future, and take care. Thank you.